believe it or not, now we have to talk about these. Yeah, really, crazy as it sounds, this is potentially where the Sony bootleg halfway there Spider-Man universe may actually become somewhat relevant. How is that remotely possible? Find out now. Yeah, believe it or not, we actually have to talk about these. So no one actually knows what No Way Home is about, except everyone seems to know that it's sort of a multiverse crossover movie like Into the Spider-Verse, but in live action, and also Marvel and all the other actors keep saying it isn't, which means it totally is. But whatever, unless a trailer drops before I'm done making this, it doesn't factor in much here. Here's what does.
On my planet, I am kind of a loser, like you. But here, we could be more.
Excuse me? You remember how the Venom movie was clearly at one point supposed to have a bunch of Spider-Man name-drop continuity stuff explicitly in it, and then Marvel also clearly said at another point, no, this is terrible, take that out so your bullshit doesn't get all over our stuff, but then Venom was so bad it was actually kind of funny and made almost $1 billion, and even China liked it because they marketed it as a joke there, and so now Marvel has to kind of acknowledge it, maybe?
Cut the bullshit. What really made you change your mind?
You did, Eddie.
Okay, it actually has been a while, this is still kind of Byzantine, and it still matters, so as briefly as possible, Marvel and thus Disney own Spider-Man, the concept, character, and rights to merchandise, publish, whatever else, but because of how deals were made back when Marvel as a company was cash poor, Sony via Sony Pictures owns the right to make Spider-Man movies, and also movies about anything that's considered a Spider-Man franchise character, which is a lot of characters, including Venom, most of the other Spider-Man villains like Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, Vulture, Scorpion, Sandman, you know, the ones you've heard of, or the ones you've not heard of, like Morbius the Living Vampire, who's getting his own movie ahead of the other guys because he's a vampire and that's a cheap, easy sell, I assume. This has actually been delayed a little while. There were trailers all over the place for a bit, and then suddenly there were not. If you're feeling like you totally forgot that was even happening, and maybe someone from Sony Pictures was hoping you would forget they made and now have to technically at some point release Morbius, it might be because it's a movie where Jared Leto plays a doctor who becomes a science vampire after attempting to cure his blood disease by, this.
I'm running out of time.
You're up to something. What is it?
That's not exactly legal.
Uh-huh. How'd you like to be the folks at Sony who have to sell that premise after 2020?
That was Wilkins of Finance. No, that was Robertson. Wilkins was Robertson. Wilkins was Robertson. That was Wilkins. Oh, yeah.
But anyway, Sony gets to make the Spider-Man and Spider-Man adjacent movies that they can until they decide they can't, don't want to, or the studio gets sold, at which point all the rights revert back to Marvel Studios and Disney anyway, but they've also just once again renewed the co-production partnership with Spidey's Rich Weekend Dad, whereby the Tom Holland starring Spider-Man series gets the Marvel stamp of approval, Kevin Feige holds their hand to help it not suck as much as everything Sony has done on their own over the last decade apart from Into the Spider-Verse, and officially takes place in the MCU, while Sony's other Spider-Man adjacent character movies are allowed to reference Spider-Man if they want to and use their own Spider-ish branding, and maybe Tom Holland can show up and maybe make specific episodes canonically official, but otherwise they're kind of hovering in their own hypothetical limbo state because basically everybody knows this is just a holding pattern for however long it takes Sony Japan to get tired of owning a movie studio with only 2 profitable IPs, both of which they have to share part of, and just unloads the whole operation onto Apple or whoever, and Disney takes all the Spider-Man stuff back. So, Venom didn't have any out loud concrete Spider-Man references in it, but that's expected to change for Venom 2, and it might have a couple because, hey, there's something maybe we can work with here after all, I guess. And Morbius was already so sure that the only way anyone was going to watch Jared Leto jump around like a bat was if maybe they thought there was an MCU connection stuff in there they had to see, so they went and put it in the trailer.
Got tired of doing the whole good guy thing, huh?
What's up, Doc?
Worst crossover ever.
Yeah, there's Michael Keaton apparently as the Vulture from Spider-Man Homecoming inviting Morbius to join Team Evil, or whatever they're gonna call it, and there's even a Spider-Man poster in the background of a shot alluding to Peter's fugitive status at the end of the sequel, except look again. That's not Tom Holland's costume, that looks like Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man suit. And over in Venom 2, Let There Be Carnage, people are reading the Daily Bugle newspaper, except the Bugle isn't a newspaper in the MCU. It's an InfoWars-style conspiracy podcast hosted by that universe's version of J. Jonah Jameson, whereas the logo design for this one, yeah, that's the same style as the old Maguire Sam Raimi movies, just like Morbius. Now, these admittedly small but highly conspicuous details, combined with the by now ubiquitous, if not still technically confirmed, rumors of Spider-Man No Way Home, featuring former Spider-Man actors Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire reprising their roles alongside Holland and former villain stars like Alfred Molina, Jamie Foxx, even possibly Willem Dafoe returning as well, have led to new speculation that whatever is happening with Sony's other proposed Spider-Man side projects, Let There Be Carnage and Morbius, are actually taking place, at least up to this point, not in the MCU, but in the same alternate universe as one of the other previous active versions of Spider-Man, possibly the Sam Raimi version in these specific cases. Now, I happen to think that makes a lot of sense. See, if the big emotional spectacle of the movie is going to be the 3 Spider-Man actors all team up, you want to make it easy and not waste screen time explaining how years and dates and timelines match up or don't. And if one of the other points is bringing these fun villains back in a fresh context, it would be fun to do it in a way that doesn't somehow undercut their original arcs or fates, or the classic films in general, by trying to retcon them into the MCU timeline full scale. It makes a lot more sense if a Tobey Maguire Spider-Man does show up, that he comes from a universe that we'll recognize as looking, sounding, feeling very much like the original movies, but wasn't exactly the same, i.e. maybe Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius didn't die or didn't stay dead, or that third movie never happened, and instead of Topher Grace, the Venom he's involved with now is the Tom Hardy Venom. Same thing for Andrew Garfield and whatever they think they need to salvage from that whole mess.
Garfield, maybe?
See, to me, that feels like a much more likely scenario and the better way to handle this kind of thing, especially if we're dealing with Marvel Studios and the aforementioned character-first edict that will probably dictate that Tom Holland's Peter and his story will be sent to stage regardless of how many cameos, characters, and continuity things are going on. Now, as to why I think weird details in Venom's trailer are a bigger multiverse clue connection for the Sony Spider-Man business right now than other angles, and why it's part of this Eternals explainer since Venom seems particularly far removed from the Eternals, funny you should ask. What we do know for sure about Thor Love and Thunder, not a tremendous amount. We know Valkyrie, King of Asgard, is looking for her queen, we know Jane Foster will become the mighty Thor, and we know regular Thor is also there, which is nice. As to the plot, we know Taika Waititi is taking inspiration from Jason Aaron's recent run on the property on the comic side, but it's unknown exactly how much or in what sense. But we do know, after some level of secrecy, who Christian Bale is supposedly playing: this guy, Gore the God Butcher, an intergalactic alien serial killer who wants to wipe out all of the gods in the universe, which in Marvel terms constitutes everything from godlike beings, a la Thor and the Asgardians, to big cosmic gods like the Celestials and a whole lot of stuff in between. So Gore is a busy boy. But he's also, apart from his weaponry, just some guy, really. See, Gore's whole thing is basically, what if Job, like from the Bible, grew himself some balls after all that bullshit? He was just a regular schmuck alien who suffered a bunch of awful, random personal tragedies his whole life and decided there couldn't be such a thing as gods because the universe was just too cruel and senseless.
I know how you feel.
And then one day, he witnessed 2 actual celestial-scale gods fighting one another to the death and realized, oh, shit, they do exist. They're just aloof cosmic assholes who don't care enough to answer prayers or help anybody. That's actually much worse. This drives Gore insane, so he takes a magic shape-shifting weapon, which the more worse-for-wear of the 2 gods had been using, all black the Necro Sword, and uses it to slaughter the other one, and, finding that having a god's weapon makes him crazy, super powerful, and apparently immortal, embarks on a huge-ass campaign of deicidal mass murder across space and time, which, well, Russell Crowe is playing Zeus in Love and Thunder, and the Eternals and Celestials will have both already been introduced at this point with their whole we are also sort of gods thing happening by then, so yeah, a couple different ways for that to fit in. Gotta imagine we'll see or hear about a whole mess of gods, probably not the ones that billions of living people still actually worship, like in the 80s Thor and Eternals comics we talked about before. That would get dicey. Getting killed by Gore as part of the plot, and I'm thinking maybe it's time for Hercules to show up. That's a couple examples, but the connection I'm looking at here is that Gore's borrowed god-killer weapon isn't just a shape-shifting sword that powers up its user and can also be armor or whatever else he needs it to be. It's a living thing with a mind of its own that actually influences its user and pushes Gore's mission in various directions. And if you think that sounds a little familiar, you're right. All Black the Necrosword is a symbiote, the same race of parasitic alien goo monsters as Venom.
Like a turd in the wind.
In fact, it's the first symbiote, and the dark god that Gore took it from wasn't just any dark god, it was a guy named Null, the original and likely most powerful dark god of the Marvel Universe, and the original enemy of the Celestials, whose birth at or near the beginning of time interrupted his prior reign of infinite chaotic nothingness and pissed him off, I guess. So Null created the Necrosword, and subsequently the entire symbiote race, as his ultimate celestial killing weapon, even beheading one of them way back in the day, creating the giant severed head that eventually becomes Nowhere.
And that's the origin of that.
So yeah, Venom and Carnage are retroactively part of the Eternals mythology as well, especially since Null eventually comes back into play in the comics for the recent King in Black storyline that makes Eddie Brock and Venom a big cosmic player and ties into another storyline, and also to Thor, how about that, where Carnage starts up a Null-oriented religious cult, and hey, look at all this churchy stained glass window stuff in that Let There Be Carnage trailer, and is Venom lugging a sword around in that shot? Well, how about that? Circumstantial and anecdotal, obviously, but again, going back to the weirdness of the Sony Marvel Spider-Man deal, if you were trying to pull all of this business together in a way that made sense and didn't insult the audience's intelligence or lean too heavily on the it's a superhero movie, just go with it meta jokes even for the MCU, Null and thus the symbiotes and anything adjacent to them being a colossal problem, so at a certain point the whole thing just got shoved into its own timeline by someone powerful enough to do that up until now, and that's why we've never dealt with Venom and the rest before, is one way to handle that. And since it's already tied up in the Thor mythos, between the backdrop of the Carnage cult, Gore using Null's weaponry, and the Thor franchise typically having been where Marvel went on the comic side to start pulling Eternals and Celestial stuff closer to the main universe, it seems as good a place as any for some of that to start happening, or at least getting dropped into the post-credits business in the movies. Or maybe involving Thor and company in the there used to be a bunch of different universes or timelines, now there's only one, except maybe there's many again, and one or more versions of your chaotic, nuanced half-brother may have something to do with that.
What did you expect?
Could get brought up in conjunction with the Eternals, Celestials, and all the theological baggage they bring with them to help the MCU iron out its take on how do the various extant monotheistic religions of the world function now that the whole world basically accepts the Viking god of thunder is a real guy, but it was just a sexy alien this whole time. Question.
These guys come from legend, they're basically gods.
There's only one god, man. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that.
Thor was a myth, and now I study him in my physics class.
If they plan on dealing with Thor's other half-sibling, Angela, the character who migrated to Marvel via litigation from the Spawn comics and was a warrior angel from heaven, like the biblical Christian one, originally, and who Marvel subsequently retconned to be an adopted angel who was originally the daughter of Odin, kidnapped by the race of angels who ruled a 10th realm that was almost like the biblical heaven, i.e. we're not saying Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and all the various Abrahamic faiths were also inspired by aliens way back when, but we're not saying that, wink wink nudge nudge, and got kicked into its own separate timeline for a while by Odin over this, so there's a place to slot some Eternal Celestial stuff in there if you don't want to pay Anthony Hopkins to come back again and smooth out the timeline while Fox News is yelling at you over the entire rest of that backstory. And of course, the mutants. As ever, trying to parse the thousands of different ways the X-Men might fit into the MCU or how someone else should do it is, frankly, something I feel like I should at least be getting paid close to as much to figure out as whoever Kevin Feige is paying to actually figure it out, so that's for another day. But if you want to know what the hell it might have to do with the Eternals, I mean, if you haven't already figured it out, since Marvel already started using Kirby's original conceit of ancient alien guys did weird science back in caveman times, and that's why some people are superheroes now to explain the origin of 75% of their stuff, that inevitably included where did the X gene that gives the mutants their powers come from, and there you have it. Simple explanation, ties things together, doesn't actually harm the core metaphor of the X-Men or Marvel mutants in general as stand-ins for whichever oppressed, marginalized group and or coming-of-age youth analogy you want to write them as.
Have you tried not being a mutant?
And if you want the specifics, okay, remember Kang the Conqueror from a minute ago and how one of his alt-timeline time travel personas was Ramatut, the Pharaoh from the future?
No.
No. No. No. No. No. No.
No?
No.
No. No.
Yes. I mean, no. No.
That story actually happened before Kang was created as a character, and the time travel pharaoh being him was a retcon that became an excuse to use the Ramatut version again going forward. Later, the perennial X-Men villain Apocalypse, whose origin story had already cast him as an ancient Egyptian who was either the first or among the first powerful mutants to manifest on Earth, got retconned further to involve Ramatut and the Celestials and Eternals into his backstory, in part to explain where his advanced technology and sense of purpose came from, but also strengthening previously hinted at concepts of the X-gene being celestial in origin.
He named him Ansabanur, which means the first one. His speed and strength were without equal. No one could touch him. Rumors of Ansabanur's inhuman might had reached the pharaoh Ramatut, who saw Nur as a threat to his rule and ordered his destruction, since nothing could withstand his wrath. Ansabanur took the name Apocalypse. Apocalypse then discovered the source of Ramatut's power deep within these chambers. He mastered the secrets of this strange technology to reshape the world in his own image. Mutants.
That
just raises further questions.
So whether the X-Men are getting jumped over from the multiverse, popping in to say, hey, we've been here all along and you didn't notice, or some combination thereof, there's mounting possibility for the big annoying space gods and their confusing new agey emissaries to serve as the quick explanation for how it happened so suddenly. And speaking of angsty teenage superheroes, Marvel's second superhero Civil War event was a Team Iron Man versus Team Captain Marvel story that had them fighting over the plot of Minority Report, i.e. a young Inhuman had emerged who had the power to predict the future, and there was disagreement about the morality of whether they should just ask him which bad guys they should beat up before they did crime. Some were for, some were against, can he really be certain, yada yada. It wasn't great. The reason I'm bringing it up here, the inciting incident that kicked the whole big thing off was, you guessed it, a problem with a Celestial.
Oh, Jesus, again?
Alright, so nobody really liked Civil War II as much as a storyline and an event in comics, and it was kind of a dud compared to how involved people got in the original Civil War, and how much of an impact it had and is still having on the direction of Marvel publishing today. But you gotta remember, in context, we're talking about the movies here, and the movie context for the words Marvel and Civil War was that the trailer reveals that Captain America 3 was gonna have basically all the Avengers in it, but they were mad at each other, and now everyone, especially the two top good guys, were gonna fight each other, blew the doors off theaters at the time because this was new to the 90% of the world that doesn't read the comics and doesn't see this happen all the time, and people got way the hell into it.
He's my friend. So was I.
So whether or not they do anything close to the storyline from Civil War II comic event, for one thing, the superhuman who inadvertently set off the previous Civil War just kinda did a no-no bad again, but this time on purpose, and she's also an eldritch god sorta maybe, I would not be shocked to see it used as the title of a movie or subtitle to a sequel to a movie like the first one in Phase 4 or 5 or 6, because now it's a callback and everyone remembers, oh right, Civil War, that's when things get serious here. Plus, while the actual plot of Civil War II doesn't feel like something that snugly fits Marvel Studios' current wheelhouse, a lot of the comic storytelling that happened in its fallout feels much more so given some of the signaling. Have you noticed that Phase 4, while still hammering away at the MCU's constant recurring themes of making one's own destiny, collective or mutually supportive action, overcoming brute individual will, and the legitimacy of communal bonds and found family over traditional institutional structures, is also going very hard on some fresh key notes, very prominently, specifically anti-authoritarianism, questioning of abusive establishment power, and focusing a lot of attention on legacy characters inheriting superhero mantles and/or younger heroes, period. Miss Marvel and Ironheart are both getting their own Disney Plus shows, with Miss Marvel herself and Monica Rambeau both set to graduate to the Marvels afterward. The Hawkeye series is about Clint training Kate Bishop as his apprentice and eventual new Hawkeye. Falcon and the Winter Soldier not only featured Sam, officially becoming the new Captain America, but also Elijah Bradley and his grandson Eli, who in the comics eventually becomes the Patriot. She-Hulk will also bring in the Hulk's half-alien son Scar, supposedly into the mix. It's hard to imagine Marvel will resist the emotional payout from WandaVision fans by eventually resurrecting Tommy and Billy, aka Speed and Wiccan, and it's even harder to imagine that the Miles Morales version of Spider-Man, or Spider-Gwen for that matter, will avoid live-action incarnations for that much longer, especially if Tom Holland does show up in Spider-Verse 2 in some fashion and thus canonizes that franchise as officially MCU connected. So that's a bunch of kids, teens, young adults, and grown-up heroes connected to the same, right? Well, for those of you who had other things to do for the last 4 or 5 years than follow this various storyline spinning out of the Civil War II event in the comics, some of the actual better ones involve Marvel taking a heavy lead into the politically activated youth moment in popular culture.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
By doing a bunch of stories about their teenage heroes, particularly the newer, more diverse ones created or revived over previous years, getting disillusioned with the grown-ups over their behavior in Civil War II, and in general, getting their screw you, we'll do things our way on in the face of, well, in their universe, the same kind of authoritarian government guys who usually crop up in the 616, but in terms of meta-narrative, an earnest, if fairly transparent, attempt to market comics to a generation of American teenagers living through the early system shock of having grown up knowing only the Obama era and now seeing not only the bad guys, but the worst possible version of the bad guys suddenly running the show again. This all played out with mixed to positive results across books featuring Miss Marvel, Miles, Ironheart, the still teenage versions of the X-Men from the 60s who were currently stuck alongside their future selves in the present.
Come again.
Which I'll deal with some other time. Lots going on at this point, intersecting with big events and culminating in a fairly recent government crackdown storyline called Outlawed that was published mainly online because pandemic and involved the government actively hunting and jailing teen heroes, specifically under a law named for Kamala banning people under 21 for doing superhero things. And if you don't see how a story set up where anyone who ever uttered some version of "Children, you put down your entertaining and beloved Marvel products right now,"
you will never play again!
can be presented as a jackbooted fascist thug running down the adorably relatable tween protagonists who will later soundly defeat them, you have not been paying attention to how this franchise and its studio uses metaphors.
Prove to me you can beat me without...
Hi, John Walker. Captain America. I think we got off on the wrong foot.
If you kill me, you'll be just like everybody else.
What's so wrong with that?
I have nothing to prove to you.
Metaphor.
Not with subtlety. Oh, and you know which incoming Marvel franchise fits so perfectly with teen heroes with powers versus authority figures who want to suppress them that Marvel had to shove them off to their own literal island during all of this in the comics to avoid how similar it was to their own previous stories? The X-Men. And literally the entire mutant thing, really. So maybe you just smush these two concepts together for the movies? Like instead of an Inhuman, Civil War II is fought over a mutant, or the mutant question in general. Maybe Civil War II is Avengers versus X-Men, and the aftermath with the angsty teen rebels is also mostly X-Men stuff. Wouldn't be the first time the MCU has arrived at a good idea by shoving multiple decades of stories into one thing. Speaking of which... So is there something this all could be leading to?
And so we enter Endgame.
No, they did that already. But since this is yet again coming in on the too damn long side and I'm running up against the end point of stuff that has enough known about it to reasonably be speculated upon, okay, I'll take a swing at the big eventuality. As established, the 2 to 3 big overarching background things being dropped in as, by the way, this is happening, so keep it in mind, atmosphere, the way Thanos and the Infinity Stones were for the Infinity Saga, are the Multiverse, the Celestials, and maybe Kang the Conqueror. Where can that go? Basically anywhere. Like, not even just in the this is fictional movies with an incredibly loose set of rules for even that sense. Any one of those 3 concepts functions like a Rick and Morty premise with time travel. They all exist simultaneously to enforce and break all conceivable rules of what can and cannot happen. But if I'm reading the stars right, and between here, previous times I've tried to work this out, and the co-writing collabs I've had over at Film Theory recently, I'm feeling above average about a good deal of this. What I'm thinking in terms of what the next ultimate Infinity War endgame level end of the saga goal point is, Secret Wars. Don't know what form, what rationale, what character, or what its endpoint is actually going to look like, but I think the name and generally understood concept is the logical goal. For the uninitiated, Marvel has published 3 different event miniseries comics with the title Secret Wars, 4 if you count Secret Wars 2, which was a sequel continuation of the first one. The original was a year-long 1984-1985 event with the very simple and effective premise of an all-powerful cosmic being pulling a bunch of heroes and villains into a battle world dimension and making them fight each other to determine whether good or evil was better. Look, they did it to sell an action figure line, alright? To justify it in the comics, they did an it takes place outside of time gimmick that had all the heroes pop back into their continuities one issue after they left, with status quo changes like Spider-Man's new black suit, so you had to read Secret Wars to find out what that was all about, but it was mostly a big old fight comic and it's fun. Secret War, no plural, was an unrelated, save for also being a Marvel story mini from 2004 that did a S.H.I.E.L.D. global espionage thriller thing with heroes and villains that set a bunch of groundwork for the bigger Secret Invasion storyline later, and then in 2015, Secret Wars, plural once again, was a 21st century anniversary take on the original premise that was also used for the first real line-wide, sort of DC Crisis-style continuity restart Marvel had ever actually attempted, taking place in the aftermath of blowing up literally the entire universe catastrophe and seeing creation itself reconstituted as a new reality comprising a mini-multiverse of contained worlds based on alternate realities from other famous Marvel stories, so House of M universe, Old Man Logan universe, Age of Apocalypse universe, Ultimate Marvel universe, you get the idea, which all went to war with each other.
Long ago, there was a vast multiversal war. Countless unique timelines battled each other for supremacy, nearly resulting in the total destruction of, well, everything.
Yes, exactly. Interesting she should mention that, huh? Until the day was saved and everything was put back into place in a new status quo wherein some dead people came back to life and a bunch of the characters that people liked from the different alternate universes, like Miles Morales, got to live in the mainstream Marvel timeline now. Oh, and the whole thing revolved around Doctor Doom, so if you were waiting for a mention of the Fantastic Four fitting into this somehow, there you go. We still know nothing about what Marvel Studios is doing there. But otherwise, I think you can see how some version of this, most likely involving the first and third versions squeezed into one thing, makes sense for an endpoint. Playing around with a wide open multiverse of possibilities in order to beef up your brand with as much intellectual property and creative potential and audience awareness thereof is definitely a fun way to spend several cycles of franchise filmmaking, but eventually you can in fact eat too much ice cream and your audience is going to start thinking, can we get back to some lean protein and change it up? And I'm guessing Marvel Disney will indeed be planning to dial it back down on the free-for-all aspect just a bit after going out with a bang with some kind of event like the 2015 Secret Wars. What's bigger than one whole cinematic universe worth of heroes coming out of portals to fight a bad guy? Lots of cinematic universe worth of lots of heroes pouring out of lots of portals to fight each other, and then also a bad guy probably. And since more than enough time will pass by this point, and who knows what the state of de-aging effects and even full-blown photorealistic CGI digital motion capture duplicates will be at that point, just try and act surprised or not get too choked up when some version of the classic 2012 Avengers themselves show up to save the day.
A hero's just someone who doesn't give up. Your dad said that.
And that's all I've got, folks. That's it. Done. This is done now. Other than putting all these together into one thing at some point and, you know, something probably when another trailer comes out, I really want to take a nice break from covering anything having to do with the Eternals for a while, so I can hopefully enjoy the movie. Hope you enjoyed this, found it informative, fun, whatever. If so, please share these with more people, because traffic is literally a living for us here, so thank you. I'm Bob, and that was The Very Big Picture.